So, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's session Accountability, Equity, and Action Building Inclusive Workplaces from the Ground Up. This session is all about exploring what accountability looks like through the lens of inclusive leadership, not just as a value, but as an everyday practice as well. We'll look at how accountability shows up at the individual level, team, and organization levels as well, and how we can move from good intentions to meaningful and measurable action. Okay, perfect. So at Power Up Leadership, our mission is to create 1 million inspired leaders by 2033. That means helping leaders across all different levels develop self-awareness and strengthen their people skills, as well as build inclusive and accountable workplaces. So every coaching conversation, workshop, or leadership development programs we deliver connects back to this goal. Perfect. On to the next slide, we will be showing you our solutions, which is a quick look at how we support the organizations that we help. We provide executive coaching for individual leaders, as well as team-based leadership training and HR consulting through our talent roadmap service that you see in the second box there. So no matter the format, our goal is always the same, which is to help leaders follow through on their commitments and hold others accountable with empathy and strengthen their communication and trust. After all, these are the building blocks of inclusive and high-performing cultures. So let's take a moment to reflect. We want to hear, in your experience, where does accountability break down most often? Is it at the individual, team, or leadership level? Sometimes it's not necessarily a personal follow through. Other times it's maybe a clear expectation or system that doesn't support accountability. And feel free to drop your thoughts in the chat, and we'll circle back to these themes throughout our session here today. Our learning objectives today is going to be about defining accountability in the context of leadership and team dynamics, as well as identifying common barriers and how to overcome them. Also applying practical tools for setting clear expectations and following through. And finally, exploring how to model accountability to inspire others. We'll connect these themes to equity and inclusion, showing how consistent and transparent accountability is one of the most powerful drivers of trust and belonging. Our roadmap for the session today, our agenda, we're going to be starting off with the foundations of accountability. So what it is and why it matters and how it connects to inclusion. We'll also be looking at common challenges, things like blurred boundaries, time pressures, and the emotional side of accountability. Finally, we'll be looking at delegation and ownership, and ending with a culture of accountability where it's part of our daily work and not something that leaders have to enforce. So the very big question here, why invest in increasing accountability and your leadership effectiveness? Well, we know that when accountability is missing, that the costs are real. Organizations are likely to face slower progress or fragmented communication and high turnover. When people don't see leaders following through, the trust ultimately erodes. And without trust, even the best of the strategies can fail. By contrast, when leaders consistently model accountability, teams are likely to stay aligned, motivated, and engaged. So it's a reminder that accountability isn't necessarily only about performance, but also enforcing that credibility. And we know that accountability drives measurable results. So when teams with high trust and clear follow through show stronger engagement, it ultimately leads to maybe lower absenteeism or even higher retention. And leadership development is a lot of the work we do, right? It comes to show our results always deliver, that it ultimately reduces burnout and improves productivity because it's going to give the people the tools to set those boundaries, which we'll see in our presentation. So this section here, we're going to be talking about the foundations of accountability, and we'll look at what it truly means to take ownership and how to move from someone saying, that's not my problem, I don't have to deal with it, to ultimately someone saying, I'll make sure this gets done. So accountability, a huge thing to know here, is it never about blame or control. It's about empowering and trusting others around you. And when leaders are able to create that environment where accountability can feel safe and supported, your performance is naturally going to improve. So this is where we're going to bring inclusion into the conversation. So when we turn accountability and connect it to DEI and turning it from our intention to be inclusive to actually producing the impact, it's where we're going to set clear goals, track our progress, and be transparent about results, both the wins and the setbacks. It's a process about being honest to yourself and identifying areas where you can ultimately improve. So when inclusive leadership becomes measurable, equity is going to stop being just an add-on, and it's going to become part of the process and how things get done. And without accountability, if we don't have that in our organizations, it's going to become performative. It's going to be more about the optics of whether we're achieving our goals rather than actually focusing on the outcomes and how to improve them. Perfect. So there are four key foundations that we've identified with accountability, which is responsibility, ownership, answerability, and follow through, which we'll look more at in the next few slides. But the definition that we have for accountability is the willingness to take ownership for outcomes, both successes and failures, and follow through on commitments. So as we go through the rest of the session, we want you to think about how these accountability principles apply to building that fair and safe and trust in your workplace. The first one we have here is responsibility, which is about clarity. So that's knowing what is expected of you, what's within your role, and where your influence ultimately lies. And because when roles and expectations are unclear, that's when accountability easily breaks down. So leaders can support their teams by defining those responsibilities early on and ahead of time and revisit them often as your priorities evolve and as the workload increases. Next, we have ownership, which is shifting the mindset, like we said earlier, from it's not my job to I'll make sure it gets done. It's making sure you have that integrity and initiative and to do the right thing even when no one's watching. So when everyone on the team embraces that ownership, it's going to ultimately create that momentum that we're looking for. And in inclusive workplaces, especially, ownership is building that impact that we were talking about. It's making that intent clear and not waiting for it to happen on its own. Next, we have answerability as the third foundation to accountability, which is being transparent and explaining your decisions and standing by your outcomes even when they're imperfect. This is where accountability and that psychological safety really comes into place and they connect, because people are going to feel more comfortable owning their outcomes when leaders model that it's okay to learn from your failures and adjust as needed. After all, your open communication is what's going to be what builds that credibility and trust within your team. And finally, as the final foundation, we have follow through, which is where that accountability really comes to life. It's when you have proven yourself time and time again, and that trust has really built. So you're building a reputation for yourself when it comes to that reliability, and people know that they can count on you, which is where your collaboration and teamwork really starts to improve, and your stress of your manager or yourself knowing that you can count on others really decreases. So it's contagious the way I see it when follow through is initiated by one person, and that ultimately can be reciprocated by others on your team because your team is going to recognize that and mirror it. So now we're going to pause for a quick poll. And the question asks, which part of accountability is the hardest to follow through in your role? So that could be, I'm sure the options came up on your screens. So there must be, I think, on the right side, a poll that you could answer. And we'll give everyone here a second to answer the poll questions. Perfect. So I see answers that have come through. So the most common one seems to be holding others accountable, which received 20 responses, a 69%. Which is, I think, the main struggle that people have here, and we'll be looking at strategies as we go along in the presentation on how the conversations and the action setting questions that we could be having with others on our team or just our colleagues in general to really prompt that conversation, because it can be very uncomfortable at times. Perfect. Okay. So next we're going to look at the 3 A's of accountability. We have the first A, which is agree, which is agreeing on goals. So representing the cycle of how accountability actually happens in teams. When we talk about agreeing, we're going to focus on what success looks like here. So we want to align our expectations up front, not halfway through a project. So, for example, a question to ask would be, what are we trying to achieve and who owns what and when will we check in? Once we are aligned on our expectations moving forward, it causes less of a barrier on how we're able to progress. The second day is act, which is acting on our commitments. So once we've had that conversation on what we're going to do, it's time for us to put that into action and follow through on the commitments we made for others. So this is where it no longer becomes just talk and actually actioning it. And finally, we have answer, which is answering for the outcomes. And this doesn't always have to mean perfection. It doesn't have to mean that everything has been smooth from start to end, but it's about the transparency and being open about the results and the lessons that were learned across that project or that journey, and how to improve for the next time. So focusing on next steps and really be forward looking in terms of what you're trying to achieve. It's important that we don't skip any of these phases as we go through the life cycle, let's say, of a project, because if we don't agree, then we're ultimately creating confusion, and then if we don't act, we're creating frustration, and ultimately if we don't answer, then you're just going to lose trust within the project and within the people on your team. So if one thing we can say, an outcome of this site, we can say, I'd say it's think about your own work and ask yourself, where in that cycle do things sometimes fall apart? Is it the agreement part that is not said at the start, or is it that the fact that there's no follow through on what people say they're going to do, or is there never feedback at the end on how you're able to do things the next time around? Perfect. So here we have individual accountability versus team accountability. So when you're working solo versus when you're within a team environment. So at the individual level, it's about your personal responsibility. So when you're managing deadlines or communicating clearly, and if you're following through with others. Whereas on the teamwork level, it's a collective effort. When your team needs clarity on who owns what or how they're going to measure that success and how they're going to hold each other accountable. And without that clarity, you're going to get what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility, which is when everyone assumes that someone else is just going to take care of it and they can just rely on that person. So inclusive teams address this by creating their shared agreements and check-ins, which is why it's very important to have regular catch-ups and regular meetings within your team or within a project you're working on. That way, it feels like there's a shared commitment, and you're not able to blame others for not doing something because it was also everyone's job to hold that person accountable as well as themselves. Here we have action setting questions on how you can make accountability practical. We can ask questions like, what could you do this week to strengthen accountability on your team? Or what action would have the biggest impact on meeting your commitments? Or what could you put in place now that would make it easier to follow through in the future? And if you took that action this week, what impact would it have on your results and credibility? So if there's one thing we can notice from these questions, that they're all future focused and they're supportive. There's no blame associated or tied to these questions. It's not a question like, why didn't you do this? Or why is the work not done yet? It's more so, what can we do differently next time? So this is how we're really going to shift that blame into a growth conversation, and rather than having it be more of a disciplinary one where you're really accusing someone. Here we have some more accountability and follow-up questions. We have questions like, what will you do? Or how will I know that you've completed the action? Or how can I help you stay accountable? So these questions really come off as coaching ones, which is a lot of the work that we try to do. So we try to frame conversations as coaching conversations rather than policing ones, and really trying to shift the blame and really try to be future focused. Because when leaders ask these kinds of questions, it's going to create ownership instead of dependency. So the goal ultimately, obviously, isn't to catch people failing. It's to help them succeed, and by staying clear and really be connected. So we want to invite some reflection here. We really want to hear from you. How do you reinforce and support accountability with your team members? That could be something that you found during your time managing others or working with others, even on what has really worked with you. Maybe we can visit the answers at the end if anyone's seeing them. I don't see them on my screen now, so that could be something that we look into at the end. Feel free to reflect on this as we go as well, or if you have any note that you'd like to add, we can definitely talk about it in the Q&A at the end. Perfect. So next we have accountability changes, and here we talk about the barriers that make it hard to achieve that accountability, because ultimately every organization has them in one way or another. Sometimes it's fear of conflict, and sometimes it's just because of the unclear expectations and lack of communication. Leaders try to do things themselves faster, like they try to take it upon themselves to try to progress the conversation, but after all, it is a collective effort here. So we want to explore those healthy boundaries that we're able to set in place that's going to help people in general overcome those challenges. Perfect. So here we have ethical boundaries to self-boundaries, because leaders have to manage two types of boundaries. You have one with others, which is where you're being consistent, honest, and fair when you're giving that feedback or setting expectations. And then you also have the boundaries that you set within yourself. So protecting your own time to focus on other tasks, or even protecting your own energy so you can deliver and follow through on your own commitments. And strong accountability does require both. If we're overextended, our follow through is going to suffer. And if we avoid that hard feedback, our credibility is going to suffer. So we're going to have to put these boundaries in place to protect both our integrity and our performance. Awesome. So I think common boundary challenges is where a lot of people, a lot of us can relate. It could be maybe we've said yes too many times to too many requests at the same time, and we're finding ourselves falling behind on deadlines, or maybe not even meeting them. And that tends to happen when we get the guilty feeling of saying no. So even when it wasn't necessarily realistic to take something additional on, we were we had that fear of saying no. So we said yes, and it was something else that we've added to our plate that we don't know whether we're going to be able to deliver on time or not. And what tends to happen is that leaders would blur boundaries with their teams. So leaders would often have to step in to fix things so that they're able to meet deadlines, instead of empowering their employees to take ownership of said issue. So these patterns are helpful in the moment, but they can create confusion and dependency over time. So when we really set that healthy boundary, it's going to ultimately help the team become more supportive and accountable, not on one another, but on themselves, and really being able to build that trust that yes, they are going to follow through on what they said they're going to achieve. So it's very easy for us to feel guilty. And there's this quote that Dr. Ramani Durvasula, she's a clinical psychologist. She said that one of the main impediments to boundary setting is guilt. And people feel guilty about setting a line and are afraid of hurting feelings. We're also reluctant to set boundaries for fear of being disliked or rejected. So in order to avoid that, and in order to make boundaries easier, we can start by asking ourselves and questioning our own expectations. So, where did we learn that saying no is a bad thing? Is it someone made us feel that way when we gave that indication that we won't be able to meet a deadline? It's very okay to have that small sense of guilt. Expecting it is normal, but it's important to remind ourselves that boundaries aren't necessarily about rejecting people. It's about protecting your own purpose and having and looking out for the benefit of everyone. So when you're able to respect your own limits, you're going to be able to create space for that sustainable performance and meeting that deadline on time. And that's the key essentially to accountability. So removing the guilt of setting boundaries. Here we have determining the source of the unrealistic expectations for yourself and expecting and embracing the guilt, as well as reminding yourself the importance of boundaries and what will you gain. So we touched on that, on the guilt of saying no and how we're really able to put that into perspective of where that stems from. Okay. Why time and energy matter for accountability. One thing to note here is that accountability doesn't really exist in a vacuum, and it's more so tied to how we manage our time and energy. So when people are burnt out, they're more likely to miss commitments or avoid tough conversations. It might be something out of the ordinary of their personality. So it tends to be when employees are missing those deadlines. We really need to take a second and see where that stems from. Is it because they're burnt out, or are they not understanding the task, or why are they feeling disengaged? So as a leader, it's going to be very important to model that balance and clarity, and prioritizing what matters and letting go of what doesn't. Because when we show up as organized and intentional, the teams are ultimately going to mirror that behavior. Perfect. So here we have being accountable and setting boundaries are essential, but without being intentional about how we use our time and energy, those efforts can unravel. So I want you to take a second to think about how we can make the most of both our time and our energy. Where do we where do we invest our energy when we have so much limited time? How do we know what to prioritize? Perfect. So here we have the 2-minute rule by David Allen. And I find that this is a great productivity tool that reinforces accountability. So what it essentially says is that if a task takes less than 2 minutes, just do it right away. And if it doesn't, if it does take longer, then you can either delegate it or add it to an existing project and add it to your project plan. And this simple rule really helps a lot of people reduce that procrastination and keep small commitments from piling up. So just get it out of the way, and we can really focus on the bigger tasks at hand. And when people see consistent action, even on small things, it's going to build a culture of follow through. Next, we had the MIT rule, which is short for the most important task rule, which is another way people are able to manage their time, where you could start your day with the most important task. You can maybe list one professional and one personal goal, or a priority of that morning that you want to focus on. And we can see that it's important to not start with these small, easy tasks and just start with what really matters. Because once that's out of the way, you're going to get a sense of relief where you're really able to feel that energy and go off of it for the rest of your day. And even if you do end up only accomplishing one thing out of your day, at least it's your MIT. You're still moving the needle on what matters the most. Here we have another method which is proven to increase productivity. So this slide reinforces why the time and energy tools matter. Because when leaders prioritize or plan intentionally, they're going to model accountability for their teams. And even when people see that consistency, they're going to want to adopt it too. So the idea we have about productivity, it's not about doing the most, it's about doing what matters, doing the most important things and following through on it reliably and consistently. Okay, here we have the next section is about delegation and how it's one of the most powerful accountability tools that leaders have. And it's not necessarily about distributing work, but you're also really going to be modeling building ownership. Because when you're able to delegate a task well, you're going to be signaling to your team that you're creating space for them to grow. So we want to think of delegation as an empowerment tool, because that way you're giving someone the authority and confidence to take that responsibility with, and you're showing them that you're able to trust them. And when people do feel trusted and that they're given ownership, that's when accountability is going to um, come into action, and it's not going to feel forced. So why should you delegate? Simply because you just can't do everything yourself. And it's important to see delegation that it's not a sign of weakness. The way we talk about it, the language we use when it comes to delegation, it's a sign of leadership maturity. So necessarily mean that you're not wanting to take charge of your own work, but it's going to help you balance that workload, develop others people's skills around you, and it frees you to focus on your strategic priorities. And when you're able to delegate with clarity, um, explain you're going to explain to your team the why and define that expectations. And it's going to become more of them checking in than rather you checking up on them. They're going to want to prove to you that they're able to take charge of the work because you've entrusted them with it. So some common barriers to delegation are fear of tasks being mishandled. So most leaders struggle to delegate because of fear that it won't be done right, or it'll take them too long to do, or you're going to have that guilt about burdening others, that I'd rather do it myself because I'm sure they already have a lot on their plate as well. But the irony here is that when you're holding on to everything, that's where you're creating those bottlenecks and you're eroding the trust. Ultimately, delegation becomes like a test of accountability on both sides because it's going to require that trust from the leader and the follow through from the team member. The best thing to do in this case would be to start small, build that confidence up, and then you're really able to celebrate when that ownership pays off. Great. Next, we have strategic delegation. So when we want to consider and decide what to delegate, or even who to delegate to, we're going to consider 4 factors, which is strengths, goals, interests, and level of skill. What we can do here is match the right task to the right person, not based off of their capacity, but based off of a development opportunity. So if you know that the task at hand is something that someone on your team is going to appreciate because that's what they're building towards, or it's going to add to their skill set or their resume or their experience, that's when we take the time to really give it to them, to show them that we're delegating something meaningful rather than just something to get off of our plates. And when it's done thoughtfully, when delegation is done thoughtfully, it's going to strengthen that accountability factor because engagement is going to increase. You're building that engagement because they're going to see the person you're giving that task to is going to see that their growth is part of the process. Okay, so next we have our next poll, which is what's your biggest barrier to delegating effectively? We have 4 options. Fear it won't be done right. It feels faster to do it myself. Lack of trust in others' skills and not wanting to burden others, which is what we were speaking about briefly. Feel free to take a second to answer the polls. Amazing. So this one I see, this poll question had a lot of differing answers in comparison to the first one. But the most one here would be not wanting to burden others. Second was it feels faster to do it myself. And then third would be fear it won't be done right. And then lastly would be lack of trust in others' skills, which is really great to see that what we're feeling here is that guilt of really adding to others' plates. But it's important to recognize that if it is something that they are interested in doing, then that makes it a better opportunity for the both of you. It's a win-win ultimately. So it's always better to focus on the 4 strategies we spoke about, on what skill we're really going to develop in our team members and our employees or in our colleagues. We're really going to want to give them something that they are interested in doing, so it doesn't really feel like we're burdening them. Amazing. So next we have modeling accountability as a leader. I feel like this is one of the most important slides in the session. As leaders set the tone. People watch what leaders do more than what they say. So it starts with simple habits. First is follow through on your own commitments. Did you do what you said you're going to do? Second is you're going to acknowledge those mistakes publicly, and it builds that credibility. If you do make a mistake, then it's okay to own up to it and say, this isn't how it's done. Now we know for the next time. It's a lesson learned for the whole team. Third, we have communicating expectations clearly, and then really giving them that ownership to take it and deliver it, see what they could do with what they're being told. And fourth, even when you don't have an answer, admit it and commit to finding one rather than misleading employees into something you're unsure about. It's okay. It's a learning process to say, I'm going to follow up on this and I'll get back to you with the answer. And when leaders really demonstrate that kind of ownership, it's going to give others around you the permission to do the same. So it's going to turn that accountability from something that's enforced to something that's really inspiring, that yes, they do the same. They do that, so maybe I should be doing the same. So accountability is really all about self-awareness. And I love this quote here, which says, relationship is a mirror in which you can see yourself not as you would wish to be, but as you are. So in coaching, we often talk about accountability as a reflection. Before holding others accountable, leaders ask themselves, where am I not following through? And how am I showing my team that it's safe to own mistakes? And there's research here from Emmy Edmondson's The Fearless Organization that shows when leaders admit their own mistakes, they actually are increasing that psychological safety. And that safety is the foundation for people to take responsibility and speak up without fear. So accountability is going to start with looking in the mirror. It's going to start with us so that we're able to expect the same of others around us. Here's a mindset shift, the accountability and empathy balance. Because the way we want to see it is that they're not opposites rather than partners, they go hand in hand. Accountability without empathy is going to create fear and silence. It's going to create that really diminishing culture. Whereas empathy without accountability is going to create comfort. There is going to be that comfort, but you're not going to see any progress. So leaders need both. You need that support, and you need to provide that support, and you need to have those expectations of your team and people around you. And it's important to know that inclusive leadership, when we connecting back to DEI, it's about finding that balance. You need to be kind and compassionate while still holding yourself and others to that high standard so the work can still be done up to the standard that you expect. And that's how you're ultimately going to create that culture of trust and growth. Next, we have authentic leadership and accountability, which is when authentic leaders are seen as the glue that holds accountability cultures together, because they're going to stay true to their values. They're going to admit when they're wrong and stay steady under pressure. And that authenticity is going to be what builds the trust. Because when leaders are real and consistent, it's going to encourage the others to step up and take responsibility and create that psychological safety that we were talking about. And when teams see that promise to lead more action, it's going to build that culture where the promises turn into actions. So here we have creating a culture of accountability, which the section talks about how it doesn't happen overnight. It's built with conversations and follow-up and then commitments over time. Here we have asking more and telling less. So this is going to be, I think, one of the most simplest but most powerful shifts that leaders can make. So instead of always giving the answers, it's important to ask questions that are going to help people take ownership. For example, what do you think the best next step is? Or what does success look like for you here? Next, we have clarifying and commit. So accountability needs that clarity. So when you don't have clear expectations, it's ultimately one of the biggest reasons that commitments fall apart. So it's important to be explicit about who's doing what and what success is going to look like. And also documenting commitments where possible. So even if it was informally in meeting, just having those informal meeting notes, it's that's still going to create visibility. And when people can see that agreement, they're more likely to follow through. Next, we have normalizing setbacks. And I think this is a big one and where inclusion really shows up. So accountability, like we mentioned, isn't about being perfect, but more so being transparent. So when things don't go right, we want leaders who can say, what did we learn from this? Instead of saying, why did this fail? Because asking, what did we learn, is going to create that psychological safety. We don't want to normalize setbacks, but when we do, right when we don't necessarily want to do it, but we have to do it because here we're encouraging that experimentation and that honesty and that learning process. We're really taking the time to understand why we went through it. Next, we have modeling accountability, which is what we spoke about earlier about how leaders can't really coach what they don't model. So if you want your own team to own their own commitments, then they need you to see you doing the same. So that means maybe showing up on time and meeting the deadlines and communicating openly when the priorities shift. So it's those small proven behaviors that are going to be what makes the most difference within your team. Next, we have building a coaching habit. So we acknowledge that accountability isn't a one-time talk. It's going to be an ongoing practice. So we want to build those habits where we have short, regular check-ins to make a bigger impact than just have it as a one-time annual conversation. So maybe asking in your one-on-ones with your team members or with your employees, for example, what's one thing you committed to last week and how did it go? Or what support can I provide to you that can help you stay on track? Amazing. So those were 5 behaviors that we could see on how we're really able to create that culture of accountability. Next, we have training your staff in accountability. So if we want to train staff and accountability, then maybe we can integrate accountability skills into onboarding and leadership development, or reinforcing the 4 foundations that we spoke about, which are responsibility, ownership, answerability, and follow through. Maybe including practice scenarios where employees can role play accountability conversations, and finally recognizing and celebrating examples of follow through integrity, really celebrating your employees when they do achieve it so they can feel the difference and be motivated to keep on repeating that behavior. Perfect. So very quickly, as I see we're running out of time, I wanted to share a coaching story that brings everything that we spoke about to life. So in one of our coaching engagements, a manager realized that their team often talked about inclusion, but rarely followed up on commitments. And through coaching, they explored what accountability for inclusion looked like. So setting clear DEI goals, and performance plans, and starting meetings with short progress check-ins. When they were able to model these behaviors and really integrate them in practice, within a few months, things were able to shift. So conversations became more transparent, feedback became more consistent, and inclusion goals became part of the everyday work. So the takeaway from this is when leaders hold themselves accountable for inclusion, their teams are going to follow their example. And this is what equity in action looks like, right? Because when you're modeling that change that you want to see, people are going to recognize that and follow through with it as well. Here we have a book suggestion from Liz Wiseman's work on multipliers, and it talks about multipliers and diminishers, where multipliers are leaders who make others smarter and more accountable, where they ask questions and delegate other opportunities for others to grow. Where diminishers, on the other hand, do the opposite. They micromanage, they overcorrect, and they take over tasks that they couldn't even handle themselves. So the result here is teams stop thinking for themselves. Perfect. So here we have a poll question. And I think after this poll, we can move on to Q&A so we can answer any questions that might have happened throughout the... Oh, actually, I see here that there was no chat feature. So if you want to submit your questions to the Q&A box, and we can go through them now. Perfect. So here we have, the question was, which accountability challenge feels most common in your work? And the most common response was avoiding tough questions and feedback, followed by followed by not setting clear standards up front, and then fixing work instead of pushing it back. So I hope we went through strategies on how we're really able to enforce those conversations and bring them up to our team members. It's more so about maybe the way we bring it up rather than and how what we say rather than what's being said. So if we know that our employees or our colleagues are going to be responsive to how we say it, to really show that the benefit here is mutual, that we're all working towards the same common goal. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time to spend together today. We'd love to open it up for questions, questions, or any reflections or takeaways. If you want to share what resonated with you the most, or maybe even where accountability challenged you in your own work, please jump in. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, Leon. A few comments we have here in the chat. Someone said, I found that outcomes were more successful when I made expectations clear and put them in writing. Then I followed up frequently. Not sure if this irritated people, but results were better.
I definitely think that's a great way to go about it, and that follows through on what we said with the 3 A's on how we're really going to set those expectations up front and follow through and then celebrate it. I'm not sure how, I think it's worth a conversation with your team of whether or not it bothered them, but to hear that you received those results is amazing. That shows that there's really an outcome coming from this, which is what we're ultimately trying to achieve. I think what can help is celebrating that outcome and really showing appreciation to everyone's time and hard work in case that bothered them, then at least they know that they've been celebrated and there's it was all worth it in the end.
Awesome. Another question here. Someone asks, can you provide insights on inclusive leadership as a key driver to higher performance?
Yeah, for sure. So when we talk about inclusive leadership, it's really about ensuring that we're really taking the time to understand everyone's perspectives when it comes to what they need from us as either a leader or either as an employee or coworker to make their time and their task a lot more easier, smooth going, and efficient for themselves. So I think maybe starting off with a conversation on what am I able to do to make this process for you more smooth flowing. That's, I think, when people really feel the most appreciated, and that's, I feel, when you get the most results out of something. So really taking the time to understand the person you're talking to and what they're looking for, so that you're able to relay that to them or give that back to them in a way that would resonate the most with them. And Susan, I'm not sure if you have anything you wanted to add to that question.
Hi. Thanks, Leanne, for your insights. I think what you said, I agree with 100%. The only thing I can think to add is that when people feel listened to me, a leadership effectiveness, inclusion, it all comes down to genuine care and people feeling listened to, valued, and heard very much in a genuine way, and their ideas are considered. So even if you don't move forward with each and every one of their ideas, they understand that you heard them and they understand the rationale as to why the idea wasn't implemented. So I think of listening when I think of a sense of belonging and inclusion.
Thank you, Susan.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great place to leave off on. Thank you so much, Leon, and thank you, Susan, for your answer at the end. We appreciate everyone who came to today's session. I hope you learned a lot. We have a lot of comments in the chat saying that this was such a great webinar and that they got some great information from it. So thank you both so much for that. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
everyone,
everyone.
so much.
Thank you.